My name is Ray Cutler. I run a small woodlot operation out of Sawyer County, Wisconsin, and I've had cameras on the timber ground long enough that I stopped thinking of it as anything but routine. You hang a camera on a post oak, you pull the card every couple of weeks, you sort deer from coyotes, from the occasional black bear, and you go on with your life. I've been doing it since 2009, 16 years of cards, of sorting footage, of knowing that country the way you only learn a piece of ground when you spend that kind of time on it. I'm telling you that so you understand what I mean when I say that what started happening last spring was not something I could explain away. I tried. I spent 6 months trying, and I'm done trying. I want to be clear about what I do before I get into the rest of this, because the context matters. Selective timber harvesting on a private woodlot isn't the same as commercial logging. I'm not running a skidder crew through there on a contract schedule. I work mostly alone, sometimes with one hired hand during peak cutting season, and I manage about 240 acres of mixed hardwood. I do what's called uneven-aged management, which means I cut individual trees or small groups rather than clear-cutting whole sections, and I leave the ground to regenerate at its own pace. It's slower work, and the per-acre return is lower, but the habitat value is higher, and the soil stays intact. And after 12 years of managing it that way, the diversity of what uses that ground has gone up consistently. I keep detailed records. I know every significant tree on the property. I know the deer movement patterns in every season. I know where the bears den in winter. 2 different sows have used the same brush pile down in the swamp hollow for the past 4 years. And I know the creek system from the headwaters on the federal land down to where it crosses the county road 1.5 miles south of my property line. I know this ground. That's what I need you to understand before any of the rest of this makes sense. This started in March of 2024. The woods up here in the northern half of Sawyer County are mostly second-growth hardwood, aspen and birch mixed in with sugar, maple, and some big basswood along the creek drainages. And back behind my woodlot, there's a stretch of federal land that runs north toward the Chequamegon-Nicolet forest boundary. Nobody hunts it hard. The deer density isn't what it is down south. The logging roads are rough enough to keep most people out, and in winter it holds snow long after the county roads are bare. I've been selective cutting on the private parcel for going on 12 years, and the edge habitat between my cuts and the federal timber holds animals year-round. The federal portion up there is a mix of mature upland hardwood and lowland black spruce, with a couple of small lakes and a lot of wet ground that doesn't drain well because the glacial till in that part of the county left heavy clay soils over most of the north-facing slopes. Good country for bear, good country for timber wolves when they're moving through. Quiet country that doesn't get much foot traffic from anyone. And that's largely the way the people who've been up here a long time like it. I had 4 cameras running that March. A Browning strike force on the main trail that comes down off the federal land and crosses my lower cut. That camera had been in that spot for 3 years, and I'd never had a problem with it. A stealth cam on a rub line up near the old skid road, where the white-tailed bucks had been working the same stand of young aspen for 3 years running, strapped to a 10-inch diameter birch at about 4 feet. A Reconyx Hyperfire up on the bench where the land levels off before the big swamp. I'd put that one there in the fall because I'd found a cluster of scrapes that looked like a shooter was using it as a staging area, and I wanted to know if he was still moving come spring. The Reconyx is the best camera I own, a professional-grade unit that runs about $550, and I bought it specifically for low-light performance because the bench is heavily shaded, and the deer tend to move through it in the last minutes of light. And a 4th camera, an older Bushnell core unit, down at the creek crossing where the deer and the bears came to drink in the evening and the coyotes moved at night. That crossing had been one of my most productive camera spots for 4 years. Everything was working. I'd pulled the cards in late February and gotten the usual mix, a big doe with triplets from the summer still running together, a small bear that had come out of den early, a few coyotes working the creek, the kind of footage that tells you the ground is healthy and nothing unusual is using it. I'd hung the Reconyx on the bench on a metal T-post because the aspen up there were all small diameter and I didn't want to strap it to anything that would move in a high wind. Standard setup. 12 feet of T-post driven 2 feet in. Camera at chest height, angled down the slope toward the scrape cluster. I pulled the cards the first week of March, and 3 of the 4 cameras had nothing unusual. A spike buck still carrying one side of his rack, working the licking branch on the rub line. A lone coyote at the creek crossing, moving fast like it was covering ground rather than hunting. The usual stuff. The bench camera, the Reconyx, was the one that was wrong. The post was down. Not wind-fallen, not knocked over by a deer or a bear. The T-post had been driven 2 feet into frozen ground, and it was out. It was lying on its side in the leaf duff about 4 feet from the hole it had come out of, and the camera was still strapped to it, undamaged, pointing at the sky. I stood and looked at the hole for a while. The ground around it was disturbed leaves pushed back. Soil around the rim of the hole pressed down in a couple of places, but I couldn't read it clearly because we'd had a thaw-freeze cycle and the surface was partly crusted. I told myself a windfall had hit it. There was no windfall. I told myself ice heave had pushed it out. T-posts don't ice heave out of frozen ground. You can look that up. 2 feet of steel driven into frozen soil in November does not come out of the ground without something pulling it. I put the post back in, reset the camera, pulled the card. 63 images. Mostly empty frames triggered by wind-moved branches, a few deer moving through at dawn, and then, at 2:14 in the morning on the 22nd of February, 11 days before I'd pulled the card, the camera had triggered on something it couldn't quite capture. The image was blown. The Reconyx has a strong IR flash, and at close range it overexposes, and whatever had come to look at that camera had come very close to it. I could see the shape of something large, a wide dark mass filling the lower half of the frame. Above it, out of the overexposed zone, the top third of the frame showed tree canopy and sky, and right at the upper edge of the mass, 2 points of light that the IR had caught and returned. Eyes. Set maybe 10-12 inches apart. Amber going to white the way eyes look in night vision IR. High off the ground, I knew the camera was mounted at 4 feet and 2 inches. I'd measured it, and the eyes were above the camera. Whatever had walked up to that T-post and put its face close enough to blow out the flash had eyes that were above 4.5 feet off the ground while it was standing close enough to nearly fill the frame. I looked at that image for a long time on my laptop that night. Then I pulled it into Lightroom and worked the exposure down, which doesn't recover blown data but sometimes shows you edge detail you can use. What I got was this. The mass in the lower frame had texture. Dark, coarse, long fiber. Not smooth hide the way a bear's coat looks in IR. Long fiber, the kind you see on a heavy-coated canine in winter, guard hair over dense underfur. And the shape of the upper portion, where it met the line of the overexposed zone, was wide at the shoulders and tapered upward to a narrow top. Not a bear silhouette. A bear's widest point in a close frame would be across the back and hindquarters if it was on all fours, or the midsection if it was standing. This was widest across the shoulders. I moved the camera. I put it back on the same bench, but I took the T-post down and strapped the Reconyx to the biggest sugar maple up there, a tree that's been standing since before I was born, at 6 feet off the ground, with a python cable lock around the strap. You lock cameras on federal land if you want to keep them, and I'd been doing it for years. I set the sensitivity to low to cut down on false triggers, cleared the card, and left it. I pulled it 3 weeks later. The python cable was still locked. The strap was still on the tree. The camera body was turned, not removed, turned rotated on the strap so the lens was pointing at the tree trunk instead of down the slope. The python cable had been pulled tight, and then the camera had been rotated inside the strap until it faced the opposite direction. Something had taken the camera in both hands and turned it. I'm going to stop there and tell you what you're thinking, because I thought it too. People mess with trail cameras on public land. It happens. Hunters who don't want their spots burned. Poachers who don't want documentation. Kids being stupid. I know all of that. But this was 1.25 miles from the nearest 2-track logging road. In March. In mud season. When nobody is walking that country for any reason. And the camera had been turned. Not stolen. Not smashed. Not repositioned at a better angle. Turned to face the tree. like something had looked at the lens and understood what it was. The card had 31 images. 28 were deer or empty wind triggers. 2 were timestamps with nothing visible, complete black frames at 3:47 in the morning, 2 nights before I'd pulled the card. The Reconyx logs a trigger reason in the EXIF data. Both black frames were logged as motion trigger. Clear night, no precipitation, temperature around 22 degrees. Something had moved in front of that camera in the dark, and the camera had seen nothing. I pulled the image data into my processing software and pushed the shadows as far as they'd go. In the second black frame, at the very bottom edge, there was a shape, partial, low, at the bottom 8 inches of something that was standing just outside the camera's effective IR range, about 25 feet out, long and horizontal, toes. The very front of a large foot pointed straight at the camera. Whatever it was, it had stood at the edge of the camera's range and watched the IR flash trigger, and it had learned the boundary. The 31st image was from the morning I'd come to pull the card. That one had me in it. I'm standing on the slope below the maple, facing uphill, looking at the camera, and I can see the moment I realized it was turned because my posture changes in the frame, my weight shifting back on my heels. What I didn't notice when I was standing there, what I only saw later on the screen, was the background. 60 yards behind me, in the gap between 2 big beeches at the edge of the frame, there is a shape, vertical, narrow, dark against the pale gray March timber. It wasn't there when I'd walked in. The gap between those beeches was clear. It was there when the camera triggered on me. Tall. Still, in line with me, watching. I did not sleep well for several nights after that. I moved the camera again. This time I took it off the bench entirely and put it on the skid road, about 200 yards from where I'd had it, strapped high on a big white oak at 8 feet. The skid road was used. I'd been pulling logs off it the previous fall, and there was still sign of activity. Old tire tracks from the skidder, sawdust in the low spots, a couple of log ends left where I'd bucked off the tops. It was open and visible, and a different kind of terrain than the dense bench timber. I figured if something was keying on the bench location specifically, moving to the road would tell me that. 3 weeks. I pulled the card in early April. The oak was fine. The strap was fine. The card had 112 images, mostly deer coming down the old road at dawn and dusk, the small bear again, a family of raccoons that found the log ends interesting. And at 4:22 in the morning on the 9th of April, something walked down the skid road on 2 legs. The image quality on the Reconyx Hyperfire is as good as trail cameras get. It's what I bought it for, the trigger speed and the image sharpness at night. What the camera captured at 4:22 in the morning was clear. It was walking away from the camera, moving down the slope of the old skid road, and it was on 2 legs. The stride was long and the posture was upright, and by the position of the head relative to the slash pile on the left side of the road, a pile I'd made myself, and knew the dimensions of the thing walking away from that camera was between 6.5 and 7 feet tall. The coat was dark, long fiber, same texture as what I'd seen in the overexposed image on the bench. The arms were long, hanging at its sides, and the proportions were wrong for a person. Too long in the arm, too wide across the upper back, and the head sat forward on the neck rather than upright the way a human head sits. Like the head was carried low and forward, the way a predator carries its head when it's focused on something ahead of it. It was walking away from the camera, down the road, in the direction of my woodlot. There were no other images of it. It had come from behind the camera, in the direction of the bench, and it had walked past the camera without triggering it. The first image was of it already 20 yards out, which meant it had passed within 10 feet of the camera without the PIR sensor catching it. The Reconyx Hyperfire has a passive infrared sensor with a trigger radius of approximately 45 feet in ideal conditions, and it hadn't caught this thing until it was already 20 yards out and moving away, which means either the camera malfunctioned on that trigger or whatever walked past it was not putting out the kind of heat signature the PIR sensor was calibrated to detect. I need to explain that, because it matters. A passive infrared sensor on a trail camera doesn't detect motion directly. It detects the difference in heat signature between a moving object and the ambient background temperature. At 22 degrees on a clear night, a deer or a human walking past the sensor would be 38 degrees warmer than background. That's an enormous differential. The sensor should have triggered the moment that thing came within 40 feet of the camera. It didn't trigger until the thing was already 20 yards away and moving, meaning either it was barely above ambient temperature when it passed the camera, or it had passed the camera slowly enough that the motion threshold wasn't met, which, at 20 yards on a reconyx, is essentially impossible unless the thing was moving at a crawl. I moved the camera again. Fourth location. This time I put it on the creek, at the crossing, in a spot I'd had the old Bushnell running since the fall. I pulled the Bushnell and replaced it with the reconyx and set up the Bushnell 40 feet away, pointed back at the reconyx tree. 2 cameras on the same location, overlapping fields of view, so that anything that came to mess with one of them would be in the frame of the other. I'd thought about this for a week before I did it. I positioned them carefully, checked the overlap, marked the fields of view with sticks on the ground so I knew exactly what each camera could see. I drove the 45 minutes out there and back on a Tuesday afternoon, and I was methodical about it, the way I am about work. I wanted an answer. I pulled both cards on the 1st of May. The Bushnell had 160 images. Deer at the crossing, a pair of otters that were new to me and a good sign for the creek health. The bear again, a big coyote pair on back-to-back nights. And on the 17th of April, at 1:59 in the morning, the Bushnell had captured something standing at the reconyx tree. It was facing the reconyx. It had both hands on the tree. The posture was unmistakable. It was the posture of a person reading something on a wall, leaning slightly forward, hands flat against the bark on either side of the camera housing, upright, 2 legs. The Bushnell is an older unit with lower resolution and the IR is weak beyond 30 feet, and at 40 feet the image was grainy, but the shape was clear. 7 feet, give or take, wide at the shoulders, long arms. The head was turned slightly to the right, toward the camera housing, and the face, I use that word because nothing else fits, the face was long. Longer than a human face, a pronounced muzzle, and the ears, both of them, rose to points above the crown of the head. It stood at that tree for 11 minutes. 11 minutes in the frame of the Bushnell. And during those 11 minutes, the reconyx, which was pointed directly at it from a distance of 40 feet, took 4 images. In 3 of them, the frame is empty. In the 4th, at 2:03 in the morning, the reconyx captured 1 image, the inside of the Python cable housing, slightly out of focus, with a blur at the bottom of the frame that the EXIF data logs as motion. The Python cable had been opened. Not cut, not broken, opened. Python cable locks use a 3-digit combination. The cable was lying loose on the ground below the tree, in the Bushnell's next frame. At 2:04 in the morning, the reconyx was still there, still strapped to the tree. The cable had been removed and set down, and the camera had not been taken. It had been looked at and left. Whatever stood at that tree for 11 minutes had not wanted the camera. It had wanted me to know it had been there. I pulled both cards and I drove home and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time before I looked at the images. And when I looked at them, I didn't show them to anyone for 3 weeks. I'm not a person who scares easily. I've spent more nights alone in timber than I can count. I've had close calls with black bears, and once a very bad situation with a bull elk during the rut that I'm still not entirely at peace with. I know how to read sign. I know what belongs in these woods and what doesn't, and I know the difference between a rational explanation and a story I'm telling myself to feel better. What I had on those 2 cards was not something I could explain, and the not explaining of it sat in my chest for 3 weeks like a stone. The person I showed it to first was my neighbor to the north, a man named Pete Halverson, who's farmed the ground up there since before I bought my parcel. Pete is in his mid-60s, Norwegian family going back 4 generations in Sawyer County, and he has the particular quality of North Country farmers where he won't tell you something is impossible just because he hasn't seen it himself. I drove over on a Sunday and sat at his kitchen table and showed him the images on my laptop, one at a time, without telling him what I thought I was seeing. I wanted to hear what he said before I said anything. He looked at the Bushnell image from the creek for a long time. He looked at the Skid Road image. He looked at the bench overexposure and at the shadowed partial foot. And then he set his coffee cup down and he asked me which creek, and I told him the north branch of the Thornapple, and he nodded in a way that meant something to him. He told me his grandfather had talked about something that came down off the federal land in certain years and made the cattle uneasy and spooked the dogs. He said it had been going on as long as anyone in the county had been paying attention to it, and that some years were worse than others, and that this spring the combination of the late snowpack and the early greenup had been the kind of spring that, in his family's experience, brought it down off the high ground more often. He didn't call it anything. He just said it. He said his grandfather's name for it translated from the Norwegian roughly as the thing that walks alone, and that his grandfather had not thought it was a bear, and had not thought it was a man, and had not spent much time trying to decide what it was. His grandfather's approach had been to give it the ground it seemed to want and wait until it went back to the high timber. Pete said that had always worked out, in the end. I asked him if he'd seen it himself. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that in the spring of 2012, he'd been out early to check a cow that was close to calving, and he'd seen something cross the upper end of his hayfield at the edge of dark. He said it had been walking upright, and it had been large, and it had not been any animal he knew, and he had gone inside and not spoken about it. He looked at me the way a person looks when they've just handed you something they'd been carrying alone for a while. I didn't press him on it. I went back out in early May and set all 4 cameras at the same time. 2 on the bench, 1 at the creek, 1 on the skid road. Different heights, different angles, different orientations. I backed up every image every time I pulled a card. I kept a log of pull dates, image counts, anything unusual about the cards or the hardware. I was going to be systematic about this. I'd been systematic about everything else in my professional life, and I saw no reason to be otherwise about this. There's something I did in May that I haven't mentioned yet, and that I want to put in here because it's part of what happened, and because leaving it out would be dishonest about the sequence. About a week after I'd reset the 4 cameras, I went back out to the bench to do some timber marking. I had a stand of mature sugar maple up there that was ready for a first entry, and I needed to get the boundary flagged before the leaves came in too thick to see through. I was up there maybe 2 hours in the afternoon, working methodically with my marking tape and my diameter tape, moving through the stand and calling out the trees I was going to take and the ones I was leaving for structure and seed source. Normal afternoon's work. I wasn't thinking about cameras or about what had been on the cards. I was thinking about board feet and crown spacing and the economics of maple versus the cost of harvest on that particular slope. I was about 3/4 done with the stand when I stopped. No particular reason. I was standing next to a tree I'd just flagged, and the afternoon light was coming through the canopy at a low angle, and the woods were full of that particular late afternoon birdsong that you get in May when everything is nesting and the days are long, and I had the clear, specific, unambiguous sensation of being watched. I've had that feeling in the woods before. Usually it's a deer you haven't spotted yet, standing still and watching you, and usually if you scan slowly you find it. I scanned slowly. I didn't find it. I turned a full circle, looking at the tree line, looking up into the canopy, looking down the slope toward the creek drainage. Nothing. The bird song continued, and the light moved, and nothing was visibly there. But the feeling didn't go away. It sat on the back of my neck for the rest of the afternoon, and I finished my marking faster than I'd planned to, and I walked out of there before I was done, which I don't do. I flagged the remaining trees 2 days later in the morning when the light was better and the feeling did not return. I didn't write that down in my log. I didn't have any evidence for it, and I wasn't going to document a feeling. But I'm telling it now because it matters to the sequence, and because later, when I looked at the cards from that period, I found an image from the bench camera from the same afternoon, 3:17 in the afternoon, which was right in the middle of my marking session that was an empty frame logged as motion. Clear afternoon, bright light, camera pointing down the slope. Empty frame. The kind of thing I'd have ignored and deleted in any other season. I kept it. May was mostly quiet on the cards otherwise. A lot of deer, the bear now confirmed as a sow with 2 cubs, the otters at the creek. I got one image on the Skid Road camera at the end of May that gave me pause. An empty frame, clear night, logged as motion, at 3:12 in the morning, and in the shadows at the very far edge of the camera's range, a shape standing in the tree line that wasn't there in the image before or after. Could have been anything. I kept it and moved on. June was when it escalated. The 1st of June, I went out to do a routine pull and found all 4 cameras turned. Not one of them, all 4. The 2 bench cameras were both rotated on their straps to face the trees they were mounted on. The Skid Road camera had its strap undone and the whole unit was hanging upside down from the strap, lens pointing at the ground. The creek camera was gone. Not the strap, not the cable, the housing was gone. I found it 6 feet away in the creek itself, submerged, resting on the bottom in 2 feet of water. Not cracked, not broken. Set down in the water as carefully as you'd set a cup on a table. I pulled the creek camera out, dried it out over 3 days, and miraculously the card was intact. What I got from it, in the last images before it went into the water, was this. At 2:27 in the morning on the 29th of May, the camera triggered on something in the water at the crossing. Standing in the creek, in the middle of the frame, facing the camera. And this time the image was not overexposed, and it was not grainy, and it was not a shape at 40 feet. It was close 15 feet at most, and the IR had caught it fully. I have looked at that image more times than I can count. I have zoomed it, enhanced it, color corrected it, run it through sharpening filters, printed it at 2 different sizes, and shown it to 3 people whose judgment I trust. What is in that image is as follows. A figure standing upright in the creek, water to mid-thigh, which puts the water depth at roughly 18 to 20 inches and the figure's height, accounting for the creek bank behind it, at somewhere between 6'8" and 7'2". The build is heavy, not obese heavy, but the heavy of something with a great deal of muscle, the way a draft horse is heavy compared to a riding horse. The coat is dark brown, long fiber, soaking wet and plastered against the chest and legs where the water had hit it, but dry and raised along the upper back and shoulders. The arms are at its sides. The hands, and I use that word because the shape at the end of the arms is closer to a hand than to a paw. The hands are open, fingers or digits spread, hanging at thigh level. The head is what I come back to. It is long and forward set, as I said. The muzzle is pronounced, but not extreme longer than a wolf's muzzle in proportion to the skull, but not the exaggerated snout of something like a baboon. The ears are high and pointed, and they are not small. They sit near the top of the skull, and they are angled slightly forward and outward, the way a dog's ears are when it is alert and focused on something directly ahead. The eyes are forward-facing. That is important, and I want to say it plainly. The eyes are set in the front of the face, close together, the way a predator's eyes are set forward-facing for depth perception, and not wide on the sides of the skull, the way a deer's or a horse's eyes are set. The eyes were open and they were looking at the camera. The IR had reflected off them, and they came back bright, almost white, in the image. It was standing in my creek at 2:27 in the morning and looking at my camera, and it knew what the camera was. I am as sure of that as I am of anything. I called a wildlife biologist at the University of Wisconsin in Madison whose work I'd read, a woman named Dr. Sarah Jennings, who specializes in large carnivore behavior in the upper Midwest. I didn't send her the image. I described what I'd found, the cameras turned and moved, the cable lock, the T-post out of the ground, and I asked her, without leading her, what large animals in northern Wisconsin were capable of manipulative behavior with objects, specifically with something like a trail camera strap or a cable lock. She said black bears are the most common culprit for trail camera interference, and that they will mouth and paw at cameras, sometimes dislodging them, but that intentional rotation or deliberate placement of a camera in water would be unusual and was not documented behavior. She noted that primates demonstrate object manipulation of this kind consistently, but there are no wild primates in Wisconsin. She said there was no large predator in Wisconsin capable of opening a combination cable lock with the combination dialed in. She said if someone had been messing with my cameras, that was the most likely explanation. I thanked her and didn't push it further, because I knew what the images showed and what a person walking that ground in mud season would have left. And there had been no boot prints. Not one. I'd walked that creek crossing twice after the camera incident, looking for any impression in the mud, any disturbance in the soft ground between the bank and the camera tree, and there was nothing. The mud on that bank was the kind of mud that holds tracks from a gray squirrel. A person of any weight walking that bank at any point in April would have left impressions I could have measured and photographed. There were none. Whatever stood at that tree for 11 minutes, getting into my Python cable lock, was not standing on the ground the way a person stands. There are no wolves in Sawyer County in established pack territory as of the spring of 2024. The Wisconsin DNR's wolf monitoring data, which is publicly available and updated annually based on winter track surveys and GPS collar data from monitored animals, shows the nearest confirmed pack territory to my ground as approximately 40 miles northeast, in Price County. Individual dispersing wolves do move through Sawyer County, young males especially, covering large distances as they try to establish territories, and I'd had a single adult wolf on camera twice in the winter of 2022. A large male, based on size, moving through on consecutive nights heading southwest. I reported those sightings to the DNR as I always do. A wolf on camera at night and close range is something I know how to read. What is in the image from the creek crossing is not a wolf. A large gray wolf in Wisconsin tops out at about 110 pounds and stands around 2.5 feet at the shoulder on 4 legs. What was standing in that creek was upright, on 2 legs, and no wolf on this continent or any other stands 7 feet tall on its hind legs and walks down a skid road with a full arm swing. I am aware of what I'm saying. I'm aware that what I'm describing puts me in a category of people that most others don't take seriously. And I've thought about that. And I've decided it matters less than being accurate. I have the images. I have the card logs. I have the EXIF data with timestamps and trigger records. I have Pete Halverson, who is not the kind of man who tells stories. And I have 63 images on a Reckonix Hyperfire from a camera that has never malfunctioned in 6 years of use. July was when I started hearing it. I live a quarter mile from the woodlot, on a county road that has 4 other houses on it, and then goes to gravel and runs north to the federal land boundary. My house is a 1-story brick with a full basement and a wood shop out back, and I've lived in it for 18 years and I know every sound this property makes. I know the creaks the floor joists make when the temperature drops. I know what the well pump sounds like cycling at midnight. I know the difference between a raccoon on the garbage cans and a skunk investigating the foundation. And I know that the coyote pack that territories the ridge behind my property howls up there on Tuesday nights, more reliably than any schedule I've ever kept. I'm not a person who lies awake listening to the dark and inventing things. In mid-July, I started hearing something at night that I did not know. It came from the north, from the direction of the woodlot, and it was not consistent enough to be wind in the trees or the creek running over rock. It was periodic, irregular, and it moved. You'd hear it from the northeast and then a long quiet, and then it would come from the north, directly, and then quiet again. The first night I heard it, I went through the whole inventory of what it could be. Great horned owls make strange sounds in summer, especially the juveniles. And there are barred owls up in the federal timber that can produce a call that surprises people who don't know it. Eastern coyotes in this part of Wisconsin get large. Some of the ones I'd had on camera would go 50, 55 pounds, which is on the upper end for the species, and a big coyote group howling at a distance can produce a sound that doesn't resolve into anything you recognize until you're close to it. I went through all of that. I am a careful person. I did not go out to look. I sat in my house with the lights off and I listened. And I thought about what Pete had said about giving it the ground it wanted. And I thought about what I'd seen on that card from the creek, and I sat in the dark and I listened. It was a vocalization. I'll say that plainly. It was an animal making a sound. The sound was not a howl, and it was not a bark, and it was not anything on the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Public Audio Library of Regional Wildlife Vocalizations, which I downloaded and listened to comprehensively that same week. The DNR's library covers wolves, coyotes, black bears, bobcat, great horned owl, barred owl, sandhill crane, loon, and a handful of others. I went through every entry twice. The closest thing in the library to what I was hearing was the wolf howl, and it was not close enough to account for what I was hearing. And I knew it wasn't close enough before I'd even downloaded the file. I knew because I had heard wolves. I'd had wolves on camera, and I'd heard them at a distance on 2 separate occasions on the federal land. And a wolf howl carries and resonates, but it doesn't do what this did in the low register. A wolf's voice starts in the mid-range and climbs. What I was hearing started below the mid-range by a significant distance. The opening of it, before it climbed, sat at a frequency that I felt in my chest more than I heard it through the wall of the house, a vibration in the building materials, and that's not hyperbole. I've been in rooms with subwoofer systems that produced that effect. This was producing it through 8 inches of brick. It started low, lower than I would have thought an animal's voice could go, a resonant chest, deep sound that you felt as much as heard through the walls of the house, and it climbed. It climbed the way a siren climbs, smooth and continuous, up through a range that went from that low chest rumble to something higher and rough-edged, and at the top of the climb it broke, and the break was the worst part, because the break had a quality to it that I can only describe as intentional. Like the break at the top was part of the sound on purpose, not a natural limit of the range, but a choice. It called twice that first night. The second call was closer than the first, and came from the northwest, which put it between me and the Halverson farm. I called Pete the next morning. He listened and said he hadn't heard it, but that he'd had his windows closed against the heat. He said, had I thought about putting cameras on the house end of the woodlot, closer to where I slept, and I said I had. And he was quiet in a way that meant he didn't think that was a good idea but wasn't going to say so. I respected that. Pete doesn't volunteer opinions about things he isn't sure of, and he wasn't going to tell me not to do something he couldn't give me a solid reason for. But I knew what the quiet meant. I didn't put cameras near the house. I want to be clear about that decision. I made it deliberately. There is a version of this that a person can step back from, and there is a version that a person cannot, and I knew by July that I was standing at the edge of something I would not be able to walk back from if I kept walking toward it. I had the images from the spring. I had the creek footage. I had what I'd heard through the walls of my house at 2 in the morning. I had enough. I wasn't sure I wanted more. But in August, I got more anyway. I had gone out on a Thursday afternoon to check the progress of a clear cut I'd left to come back. I do small selective cuts, and then I leave the slash and the tops and let the new growth come in for the grouse and the deer, and I keep records of how long regrowth takes on different soil types. I had a patch off the skid road that I'd cut in the spring of 2023, and I wanted to see how it was coming. It was late afternoon, still light, a calm day with a little south wind, and I was working my way through the new growth when I found the tree. It was a big sugar maple at the edge of the patch, one I'd left standing because of diameter and form, probably 90 years old, maybe more, 22 inches at breast height. The bark on the south face of the tree had been worked. Worked is the right word. From about 18 inches off the ground to somewhere around 7 feet, the bark had been scored with long parallel lines, deep enough to show cambium, running roughly vertical with slight variations. I've seen bear claw marks on trees. Bears mark trees, usually hardwoods, with their front claws, and the marks are typically 4 or 5 lines, close together. At the height, a bear can reach on its hind legs, which is about 7 feet for a large black bear. These were different. The lines were spaced farther apart. The widest spread across the full set of marks was about 16 inches, and they were deeper than I've seen from bears. Deep enough in places that the bark hadn't just been scored but peeled. The outer bark stripped off to a length of about 2 feet in 3 of the marks, and they started at 18 inches, not at ground level the way a bear's marks typically start when it's raking a tree while standing. 18 inches is about where something bipedal would begin a reaching stroke if it were standing upright. 7 feet is above what a large black bear in this region can typically reach, and black bears in Sawyer County rarely exceed 350 pounds. I know what bear sign looks like. These were not bear marks. I photographed the tree. I measured the marks with a tape. I cross-referenced the mark depth and spacing against the Wisconsin DNR's published guidance on identifying black bear sign, which includes claw marks on trees and describes typical dimensions, 4 or 5 lines, close set, averaging about 4 to 6 inches total spread for an adult bear. I also looked at published research on bear claw marks as territorial markers, which tend to cluster at a consistent height corresponding to the bear's full upright reach. What I found on my maple did not match any of those references on any of the key dimensions. Not the spread, not the depth profile, not the starting height, and not the length of individual marks. I went back to that tree twice more before the leaves came in and measured again on both visits and got the same numbers. I went home and I looked at the images for a long time. The 16-inch spread across the full mark set, if made by a 5-digit hand, suggests a hand span considerably wider than a large human hand, which runs roughly 9 to 10 inches from thumb to pinky, fully spread. I'm not saying it made those marks with its hands. I'm saying the geometry of the marks is consistent with what I saw in the creek image, the open hands, the spread digits, and that the consistency is not something I engineered or imagined. The last week of August, I set up a new camera arrangement. Not at the bench and not at the skid road and not at the creek. I set up 2 cameras at the maple. One on the tree itself, pointed south toward the clear-cut edge, and one on a post oak 20 yards east, pointed back at the maple. The same overlapping setup I'd used at the creek. I set them the morning after I found the marks, running on lithium batteries, because alkalines in August heat lose capacity. With a fresh Lexar card in each unit, and both cameras set to the highest trigger sensitivity, I left them for 2 weeks. The morning I drove out to pull them was a Thursday in mid-September. The leaves had started turning. The aspens go first up here, yellow-green going to gold at the crowns, and the light was that low-angled fall light that makes everything look like a photograph of itself. I drove in on the 2-track and parked and walked the half-mile in to the clear-cut. It was a good morning. Grouse in the new aspen growth, a doe and 2 fawns working the edge of the cut, the smell of leaf mold and cool air. The kind of morning that makes you glad you chose this kind of work. The maple was untouched, both cameras in place. The post oak camera showed nothing unusual on its card deer, a turkey hen, a red fox that came through twice, 106 images. The maple camera had 409 images. I went through them in the truck before I drove home, on my laptop, with the engine running and the heater on because the morning had gone cold. The first 380 or so were routine deer, squirrels, a coyote pair on the same night, a porcupine that spent nearly an hour at the base of the maple and triggered an image every 30 seconds. Then on the night of the 4th of September, at 11:48 in the evening, the camera triggered on something at the south edge of the clear cut. It was standing at the tree line. The camera was pointed south and the clear cut ran away from the camera for about 60 yards before hitting the original timber. And the thing was, at that timber edge, 70 yards out in the dark. The resolution at that distance in IR was limited, but the shape was unmistakable by then. I'd seen it enough times in different images that the shape was something I could read. Upright, long arms, wide at the shoulder, standing still at the edge of my cut, looking toward the maple, looking toward the camera. It appeared in 47 consecutive images over the course of 2 hours, standing, sometimes closer, sometimes at the far edge, moving along the timber line but always facing the camera, always upright, never once dropping to 4 legs in any image. In the images where it was close enough for the IR to give me any detail, the coat was the same dark brown, long, the same heavy build. In 3 images, it was close enough that I could see the forward-set eyes reflecting the IR, the same amber white. And in 2 of those 3 images, both ears were clearly visible, high and pointed, angled toward the camera. At 1:51 in the morning on the 5th of September, It walked into the clear cut. It crossed the 60 yards of open ground in a straight line toward the maple, and the camera caught it in 10 consecutive frames at 10-second intervals. The stride was long and the pace was unhurried. In the 5th frame, it was 30 yards out, and the detail was the best I'd gotten at a distance in any of the footage from the whole spring and summer. I looked at that frame for a long time. The height relative to the slash piles on either side, I knew those piles. I'd made them. I knew how tall they were. Put the figure at just under 7 feet. The arms swung with the gait, a full arm swing, the way a tall person walks when they're moving with purpose. The head was forward and slightly down, oriented toward the maple, not scanning the cut but fixed on the tree. In the 8th frame, it was 10 yards out and the camera was firing at full resolution, and the IR was solid, and I could see it as clearly as I've seen anything on a night camera in 16 years of running trail cameras in the proppers. Wisconsin timber. In the 9th frame, it was standing at the tree, and it had one hand on the bark, over the old claw marks, and its head was turned, looking at the camera, directly at the camera. And the expression, I don't have another word for it, was one of recognition, not alarm, not aggression, recognition. The way a person looks when they come back to a place they know and find it the way they left it. The 10th frame was the last. In it, the camera had been contacted. The housing was being held, the frame was at an angle, and the upper portion of the frame showed the sky and the upper canopy of the maple, and at the bottom of the frame, just barely in field, one hand on the housing, 5 digits, long, dark, the joints visible. A hand that was shaped like a hand and was not a human hand, and it held the camera the way you'd hold something you were examining, careful and deliberate. Then, no more images. The camera was running when I pulled the card. It hadn't been damaged or turned off. It had simply not triggered again after that frame, and when I walked to the maple and looked at the camera, I found it in exactly the same position I'd mounted it, pointed south across the cut, undisturbed. The cable lock was in place. I sat in my truck for a long time. I drove home. I ate lunch without tasting it. I called Pete in the afternoon and I told him what I had, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said, was I still planning to keep running cameras out there? And I said I didn't know. He said that in his grandfather's time, the way it usually went was the thing would move through for a season and then go back to the high ground, and that trying to document it seemed to work the same way as following it or running from it. It let the thing know you were paying attention to it, which was the part that made it stay interested. He said that quietly, not as a warning, just as information, the same way he'd give me information about a pest species in my timber. He said he thought it would help if I gave it some time without cameras, without pulling cards, without walking the ground. Just leave it, he said. See if it moved on. I left the cameras in place through the fall. I didn't pull the cards. I kept up with my other work, kept to the parts of the property that were open and away from the federal land boundary, and I waited. The vocalizations came twice more in September, once from close enough that I heard it clearly through closed windows at midnight, and once in the early hours of the 1st of October, far off to the north, the direction of the high ground. That second one might have been going away. I told myself it was. I pulled all 4 cards the first week of November. It took me most of a Saturday afternoon to go through everything, and I'm going to tell you what I found, and I'm going to tell you what I'm doing with it. Between mid-September and the first week of November, there were 212 images of deer across the 4 cameras, a dozen of the sow and cubs, the coyote pair again, and a wolf, a different animal than the one I'd had in 2022, larger, with a damaged left ear that showed clearly in the IR. 212 images of animals that belonged in these woods, and 1 image from the bench camera from the 23rd of October at 3:41 in the morning of the tree line at the edge of the bench, looking dark and still and empty except for, at the far left edge of the frame, in the shadows under the big sugar maples, a shape standing at full height and facing the camera, too far out for the IR to give detail, but close enough that the proportions were clear, and in it both eyes caught the IR flash back, amber white, 7 feet off the ground, forward facing. It was still there in October. It hadn't gone back to the high ground, or if it had come back. And the eyes in that image, the forward-facing amber-white eyes at 7 feet, were not looking at the tree. They were looking at the camera. They were looking past the camera. The way you look at something when you know the camera is there, but the camera is not the thing you're looking at. I've been a cautious person my whole life. I run my business carefully. I maintain my equipment. I document what I do and why I do it. I'm not a credulous person, and I'm not a dramatic one. I don't want anything from this story except to have said it accurately, the way I'd want any piece of work done, clearly, with the details right, without exaggeration or decoration. What I had on that property from March to October of 2024 was not a bear, and it was not a person, and it was not any animal I can name or find in any resource that documents the wildlife of northern Wisconsin. I know what I saw in those images, and I know what I heard through the walls of my house at 2 in the morning, and I know what Pete Halverson's family has been quietly aware of for 4 generations on the ground north of mine. I've sent copies of the key images to 3 people. One is Pete. One is a trail camera enthusiast in Ashland County who has more experience with camera hardware than I do, and who confirmed that the rotation and repositioning of the cameras was not something that could be attributed to malfunction or wildlife incidentally hitting the straps. He's had cameras stolen, and he's had cameras destroyed by bears, and he's had cameras dislodged by falling branches in windstorms, and he said, what happened to mine was none of those things. His assessment was careful and specific. The T-post would have required a sustained upward pull of probably 300 to 400 pounds of force to extract from frozen ground. Based on the depth and the soil conditions, and a bear pawing at a camera strap attached to a T-post would not produce that force vector. Bears push and rub and mouth. They don't grip and pull straight up. He said that to extract a T-post from frozen ground, you would need something with hands. He said it matter-of-factly, without theatrics. And then he was quiet on the phone for a moment and said he'd had some odd things happen to his cameras in the Penaky Hills a few years back that he'd never fully explained. And that was the end of that conversation. The third person I sent the images to is a wildlife researcher who studies large carnivore behavior, and who, after looking at the creek image and the clear-cut sequence, told me he had no explanation for what he was seeing and asked if he could share the images with colleagues without attribution. I told him he could. I haven't heard back from him on whether he found anyone who could account for it, and I don't expect to. I pulled the cameras in early November, all 4 of them. I stripped the cards and backed everything up, and I took the cameras off the trees and the posts, and I brought them home. The bench is still there. The skid road is still there. The creek is still running, and the crossing is still there, and the T-post holes have filled with leaf duff by now. I'm not going back out there with cameras, at least not this winter. Pete said, give it some time. And Pete has been right about most things I've asked him about in the 18 years I've been his neighbor. And I don't have a better approach than to take his advice. The ground is still mine. The woodlot still needs tending, and the timber contracts still need to be met. And in the spring, I'll need to assess the new growth in the 2023 clear cut and plan the next one. I'll be back out there. I'll be on that ground with my chainsaw and my skidder and my marking tape like I've been every spring for 12 years. I'm not leaving my land. I'm just not doing it at 2 in the morning, and I'm not announcing myself with cameras and IR flashes anymore. What I have is what I have, a sequence of images from March to October that documents something I cannot explain, interacting with my equipment in ways that suggest not just size and physical capability but awareness. Deliberate action, an understanding of what the cameras were and where they were, and, in the end, what I was doing out there and why. The last image from the clear-cut camera, the one with the hand on the housing, I've looked at it probably 200 times. The hand is careful. There's no other word for it. It's not the contact of an animal bumping something in the dark. It's the deliberate grip of something holding an object it has picked up before, examining it with the patience of something that has all the time in the world and knows it. I don't know what it is. I've read everything I can find, and what I've read either goes too far or doesn't go far enough, and none of it accounts for what I have on those cards from Sawyer County. What I know is that it has been in that timber for longer than I've been on the land. probably longer than anyone in the county has been keeping track, and that it has its own relationship to that ground that has nothing to do with me, except that I put cameras in its way, and it kept finding them. And I think the reason it kept finding them, the reason it looked at everyone and turned it or moved it or put it in the water or just stood in front of it and let the IR catch its eyes, is that it wanted me to know it had found them. That's the part I keep coming back to. It could have stayed off the cameras. An animal that could stand 20 feet from a reconyx at 22 degrees and not trigger the PIR sensor until it was already past could have avoided every image on every card. It didn't. It let me see it, on its own terms, when it was ready, for as long as it chose. The creek image, the clear-cut sequence, that last image from the bench camera in October, standing in the dark at the tree line with its eyes past the camera, looking at whatever it was looking at beyond the edge of my ground. I don't know what it saw. I don't know what it's watching from the high ground when it comes down in certain years and moves through the edges of the woodlot and calls through the timber at 2 in the morning. I don't know if it's curious about me specifically or about people in general or about nothing at all, and what it was doing in my creek at 2 in the morning is something I have turned over every day since May. What I know is this: it knows this ground better than I do. It has known it longer. And when I go back out in the spring with my saw and my marking tape, I'll know it's there, and I'll know it's watching, and I'll work my timber and go home before dark. And I'll be grateful that so far the only thing it's ever done with my cameras is put them in the water and turn them to face the trees. So far. I drove out to the woodlot this past weekend, just to walk it, without cameras, without a plan. The aspens in the new growth are holding their last leaves, brown gold and paper thin, and the maples are bare now and the light comes through the canopy flat and gray, the way it does in November. I stood at the bench for a while and looked north toward the federal land, toward the high timber where the ridge lines disappear into the spruce and the ground gets rough and wet and nobody goes in winter. The woods were quiet. A newt hatch somewhere in the big maples, a raven working a thermal over the ridge. The normal sounds, the sounds that tell you the world is still working right. I thought about the image from the creek. I keep coming back to it the way you come back to a piece of work that isn't finished. There's something in it that I haven't resolved and I'm not sure I can. The posture of it, standing in the water, the openness of it. It wasn't crouching, wasn't trying to be small or hidden. It was standing in the middle of my creek in the middle of the night with both eyes on the camera, and it did not look afraid, and it did not look threatened, and it did not look like it was doing anything other than exactly what it had decided to do. That's what gets me. In everything I've documented in 16 years on that ground, in every deer, every bear, every coyote, every animal I've caught on camera doing something, there is a quality of animal behavior that involves the animal's relationship to the camera as an unknown object, a wariness, an investigation, a moment of alarm before the animal decides the thing is safe. Every animal responds to a trail camera the same way: encounter, assessment, decision. This did not do that. It stood in the creek and looked at the camera the way you'd look at a thing you'd seen before and already understood, and the decision had already been made somewhere back down the road. And what I was seeing in that image was the conclusion of a decision-making process I hadn't been part of. That's what I mean when I say awareness. That's the word I keep using, and I want to be precise about what I mean by it. Not intelligence in the abstract sense of problem-solving or tool use, though the cable lock suggests something along those lines. I mean the specific quality of a mind that has already categorized you, already placed you in context, already decided what you are and what you mean, and what, if anything, to do about you. The kind of awareness that looks at a camera and sees the person behind it rather than the object in front of it. I didn't hear anything from the high ground the afternoon I walked out there last weekend. I didn't see anything in the tree line. The bench was just the bench, the big sugar maples, the duff floor thick with leaves, the sky going gray in the north, the way it does before the first real cold of the season. Everything exactly the way it should look. But I stood there a while anyway, and before I turned back toward the 2-track and the truck, I did something I hadn't planned to do. I nodded, once, at the tree line, at the high ground, at whatever is up there in the timber I can't see from where I was standing. just a nod. The way you'd acknowledge something that you know is there and that you have no other language for. I don't know if it means anything. I don't know if it registered or if it was seen, or if any of it matters to something that has been in those woods since long before I showed up with my marking tape and my cameras and my careful records. I'm a person who documents things, and what I've documented this year has brought me to the edge of what documentation is good for. Past a certain point, the thing you're looking at doesn't fit in the frame you built to contain it. I built the frame, the camera logs, the EXIF data, the timestamp records, the measured heights and distances, and what came to look at my cameras in the dark of my timber on the north end of Sawyer County walked right past the edges of it, every time, on its own terms, in its own time. Then I walked back to my truck and I drove home. And that's where I am now. And that's all I've got.